Good afternoon, everybody. Joe Baker here with the Edit Bay. This is a follow-up tutorial to my recent post on editing raw images from the Phantom 3. Today, we're going to cover the Phantom's log profile, its purpose, and how to work with it in post. Any halfway decent camera these days will be able to shoot raw stills. Even cheap mirrorless and DSLRs can shoot raw stills, but being able to shoot raw video is still a high-end feature. And even if you have a camera that can shoot raw video, you're going to need a beast of a computer with a ton of storage space to process it. This is where log profiles come in. They're the next best thing. It'll still use lossy compression. It'll be the video equivalent of shooting JPEG stills, but it will reduce the extent to which certain parameters are applied in camera, giving you more flexibility in post-production. So it'll apply sharpness, but only a little bit. It'll apply saturation, but just a tad. All of these parameters will be applied by us in post. And that's the point, by the way. Log profiles are designed to give you latitude in post. So if you want to post to YouTube out in the field, you're not going to want to shoot in log. So before we begin talking about how to process log files in post, let's quickly talk about how to set it up in camera. It's not enough to simply set your P3's camera to log and call it good. You'll have to access your advanced options and reduce contrast, saturation, and sharpness all the way. Yes, this will make your image look like absolute garbage. It'll be washed out, almost smeary looking due to the lack of in-camera sharpening. It'll look almost grayscale due to the lack of in-camera saturation. So it may cross your mind to add just a little bit of in-camera sharpening to the image. But the in-camera sharpening is applied globally, and the results aren't nearly as good as what you can get with post-production sharpening. So the best practice is to reduce everything as far as it will go and don't show the unedited footage to a client. So for demonstration purposes, I only have this one tiny little clip here, but when you're back in the Edit Bay, you're going to want to lay out all of your clips in your timeline, make your cuts, add your music bed, sound effects, and so on. Just make sure that color correction and color grading is done at the end of your pipeline. These are processor-intensive effects, so you want to make sure that you have picture lock before you start adding color effects to your footage. I'm here in Adobe Premiere Pro, and if you've been following the Edit Bay for a while now, you know that I love Red Giant's color sweep for color grading. But since Adobe just released the 2015 version of Creative Cloud, I'm going to demonstrate these techniques using their new Lumetri Color Panel, as it was modeled after Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, so it'll be familiar to those who just watched my last tutorial. So we just need to select the clip that we want to grade, come up here to the top of the UI and click on Color. And that's going to rearrange your workspace to the color mode and reveal the Lumetri Color Panel over here on the right. But before we start messing with the sliders, let's check out the scopes over here on the left. Click on Lumetri Scopes. One thing I love about grading video as opposed to stills is with video you get far more useful scopes. This is called the Rgb Parade. It's similar to the histogram, but it breaks it up into separate color channels and just makes it a little bit easier to understand. This is the vector scope. It gives you information about saturation. So if you can imagine a color wheel right here, this stuff right here in the middle is called trace. On any scope, by the way, this is called trace. But in the vector scope right here, the closer things are to the center, the more desaturated things are. So you can take a look at my image. It's not super saturated, and the vector scope is indicating that by having all the trace towards the center of this color wheel. If I were to increase saturation, let's come over here to here. You see what's happening with the trace? It'll go more towards the outside of the scope as you increase saturation. And the purpose of the Rgb Parade is to give us information about contrast or tone. And if you can look at my trace right now, the very top up here where it says 100 and 255, this is indicating pure white. Down here where it says 0 is indicating pure black. This is why we shoot log profiles. I don't have anything in this image that's pure black, and I don't have anything in this image that's pure white. This is going to give us some latitude to stretch this trace out however we'd like to suit our needs in post-production. Color grading is an art in itself. The purpose of this tutorial was to help you understand what log profile will give you in the Edit Bay, but I'll quickly run through a look you could give a not so attractive shot. So we have some ugly greenish water here at the pond. There's a pretty severe drought in California, so we've got some patchy grass and trees that have seen better days. There are times in filmmaking or videography when it's best to take the angle of least resistance. Now I could fight the lack of beauty in this shot by trying to saturate the grass and the trees. I could try to shift the hue of the water to look slightly more appealing, or I could run with it and try to create a drab, gloomy, almost creepy look. Sucking the happiness out of a shot usually involves decreasing saturation, increasing contrast, along with leaning towards cooler colors such as blue, green, and aqua. Warmth usually conveys romance, beauty, happiness, and to be honest, it's what we're all more likely to add to aerial shots. So, in the interest of being different, let's play with some of these new tools. In the Lumetri Color Panel, we have the option of adding a LUT. And a LUT stands for Lookup Table. A LUT is more or less a preset that you can slap on your footage to give you a head start. They're more useful for filmmakers on set when they're using a camera that shoots log. A LUT can be applied to their recording device to allow the director to get a better sense of how the shot will look once it's graded, and to reveal details in the image that are minimized by the log profile. Anyway, I found that the ARRI Alexa profile gives you a fairly decent jumping off point for the Phantom 3's log profile. Basically what this is doing is giving us a basic color correction. You can absolutely grade your footage without a LUT, by the way, but they're sometimes useful as a jumping off point. So let me go ahead and disable that LUT really quick. Take a look at the trace over here on the Rgb Parade and see what happens. That's without the LUT, and that's with it. So it slightly expanded our trace, got us a little bit closer to pure black, got us a little bit closer to pure white, increased saturation a bit. As you can see, the trace on the vector scope kind of shot out here towards the outside, and we're headed in the right direction. So let's go ahead and play with some of the sliders right here and see what we can create. We have a temperature slider, and if we move this to the left, it'll give us a slightly cooler look, which again, take a look at that Rgb Parade. You can see the blue channel. If I raise it to the right, only the red channel goes up, pulls down the blue. If I go in the opposite direction, we can see by our scopes over here, this is kind of the look we're going for. We want to make it look a little bit cooler. Now exposure, we might be able to increase that a little bit. I'm going to come back to that. What I want to do is, because I'm going for kind of a creepy look with this shot, I want to retain as much detail and contrast in those clouds as I can. So I'm actually going to bring the highlights down a hair. That way when I raise my contrast, they don't get super blown out in the sky. Actually, I don't think I'm going to raise my contrast. Shadows, we may want to boost the detail in the shadows a little bit to retain some of that detail in the trees. But from this point, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease a bit of my saturation. Okay, now if you click over here on the creative panel, what it'll do is it'll collapse the basic correction and pull up this next panel for creative looks. Now we had LUTs on basic correction. We have something similar under the creative section, which is basically the same thing. It's basically slapping a preset on your footage that we can decrease or increase the intensity of. So I'm going to go for one of these here, play around with these blue ones, because again, we're going for kind of a cool, that might get us in the right. That may actually be better, but I think what I'm going to do is definitely decrease the intensity of that a bit. That's without it. Pull a little bit of that blue in there. Now I'm going to come down here to my color wheels, and I want to tint my shadows more blue. You see what that's doing to the trees and to these reflections on the water over here? We're giving them a little bit cooler look. Now, a typical thing that's done in Hollywood and many films is to warm up the highlights. But again, that's really not the look that we're going for in this sense, because we want it to be more gloomy looking, kind of darker looking. This tint balance slider over here, the way that this was explained to me is if I move this to the right, more of the parameters that you set in this color wheel will be applied to the image. If I move it to the left, more of the parameters you set in this color wheel will be applied to the image. So I kind of want to make this even bluer right now, and I'll move this a little bit more to the right. Make this shot just look a little bit gloomier. And I think for right now, that will get us where we want to go. By the way, you can toggle off the effects of this by going over to your effect controls and simply hitting this effects icon. That's your ungraded log footage. Looks washed out, lacking in color saturation, looks pretty much ugly. That's with the effects back on. Come back to our scopes. I mentioned earlier that one of the huge advantages of shooting log is we can really decrease the amount of in-camera sharpness that's applied to the image. So one thing you could do is if you come over here to your effects and type in Unsharp Mask, if I apply this to my footage, what I can do is come over here to my effect controls. I can control the amount. I usually set this at about 2. And then raise this up to about 75. And that usually gives me a pretty decent looking, I'm going to expand this out so you guys can see it. That usually gives me a fair amount of masking. The advantage of this, a fair amount of sharpening. And the advantage of this is you can mask it out. So if I don't want that level of sharpening applied to my water, I can actually just have it apply only to the ground over here. But for this particular shot, I'm going to go ahead and delete this effect. I'm going to come back to the Lumetri Color Panel. We can apply it in the Creative panel. over here with this slider right here, I usually set this to about 3.5. Again, that'll apply it globally to the image. Let's go ahead and select this Curves panel right here. Curves is a pretty slick tool. You can do a ton of color grading with just this one tool alone. But what we're going to do is come over here to our scopes, and we're going to take a look at our contrast here. Again, we don't have anything in this image that's veering towards pure black, so we can increase that by creating a couple of dots on here and maybe reducing this one just a hair and see what that trace is doing. Now we're getting down, at least headed in the direction we want to go for this more gloomy look. Okay. Now, by the way, when you are in an RGB workspace, increasing contrast will also increase saturation. So I'm going to come back here to the basic correction, and we're going to dial this back a bit. I'm going to compensate for that. Let's go back to curves. We are not approaching pure white just yet, and I think that's okay, because again, I kind of like what the clouds are doing right here. We can see a little bit of texture in the clouds. You know, if this was a raw still, we could get that detail with no problem, but we are still working with lossy compression here with video. So I think what I'm going to do now is come over here to my Hue and Saturation Curve tool. And this is actually a pretty slick tool. It's not quite as intuitive and useful as what you've got in Camera Raw and Lightroom, but you know, for video, it's a step in the right direction. I think what this image is starting to do, I think the grass and this little tree right here are kind of becoming the subject of the shot. So I want to try to draw the viewer's attention more towards this area of the image. And we can do that by focusing on the grass and this tree right here with color. So if I select yellow and green, what we can do is actually increase the saturation with these two little handles right here. And we can decrease saturation in the other parts of the image. I'm bringing in a little bit of that blue, taking a little bit more of that blue out. So basically every color with the exception of yellow and green is getting desaturated right now. So that's definitely working to make this more the subject of our shot. So the other thing that we might want to address at this point is the fact that the sky is still a little muddy looking up here. I can try to bring some of that detail back with the other sliders, or we can try to cover it up. So I can go over here to the vignette, and I can increase the amount of vignette. By the way, if you move it to the left, it's going to make the edges look darker. If you move it to the right, it's going to make it look white. So we're going to move it to the left a little bit to increase that vignette. You know, so it's going to darken down. I'm going to show you the extreme. Obviously, we wouldn't want it to look like that, but just to give you an idea what that's doing. And we'll feather that just a little bit more. So it's a really subtle effect right there. I did have somebody send in a question recently regarding the tilted horizon look, and it does look a little bit in this image that my image is skewed a little bit over here to the left. So a quick fix for that is just to make sure that your clip is selected. Come up here to, Effect Controls. And you're going to go to Motion and Rotation. Now I'm going to move this to the left a little bit. Excuse me, to the right. And I think I'm going to set that at 1. Will probably do me just fine. That seems to level out the horizon, but you can see it kind of clipped off part of the image down here. There are 2 fixes for this. An easy one would simply be to scale up your image to say 103. No problem. This is 4K footage. We can totally do that. The other thing that you might do, I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 100. The other thing that we can do is simply cover this up with an anamorphic overlay. So I have one right here. I'm going to drop out. This is a ping, and this is for 1080p. And again, I mentioned this is 4K footage, so we need to select this, come over here to Motion, and we need to scale this up so that it kind of fits right here. And basically what I'm doing is now I'm just cutting off some of that sky, and having a little bit of wiggle room down here on the top and bottom of my image allows me to actually recompose my shot if I wanted to. I could come over here to Position. Whoops. Let me undo that. Excuse me, select my footage, come over here to Position, and I can actually move this around if need be. All right, one quick tip I'll end with here is if you have worked long and hard creating a look that you think you may use again, you can actually save everything that you've done over here as a preset. So you come over here to your Effects Control panel, right-click on the effect, and select Save Preset. Simply give it a name. You can write a description here if you'd like, and click OK. And then the next time you need this preset, if you come over here to Effects, you can search for it. I named this look Supernatural after the TV show Supernatural because they do tend to use a similar color scheme. And you can simply drag and drop that onto your footage and create the same look instantaneously. So log profiles definitely retain some information for you, so you've got some wiggle room in post. I'm going to toggle this effect off. That's what we started with. That's our log profile, and this is with our color correction and color grading applied. Huge difference. Very, very useful tool. So once again, my name is Joe Baker with the Edit Bay. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel. I'd appreciate the support. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the box below. I'll see you next time.